Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today is a Catholic poet, translator, and critic who writes under the name of A.M. Juster. He took that name, an anagram of his real name, Michael J. Astrue, in order to carry on his poetic activities simultaneously with a high-level career as a lawyer, biotech executive, and public servant, most notably serving as Commissioner of the Social Security Administration from 2007 to 2013. He has published multiple books of his original poems, most recently Wonder and Wrath in 2020, and his work as a translator includes volumes of Petrarch, Horace, Tibullus, and the Latin verse riddles of the Anglo-Saxon bishop Saint Aldhelm. Some of his upcoming projects include another volume of Petrarch poems, a children's book about a female juvenile manatee called Girlatee, and an anthology of poems about the legendary phoenix from Ovid to Shakespeare. And before I start the interview, let me just remind you, if you haven't already, consider going to catholicculture.org/newsletter and signing up for one of our email newsletters so you can keep up with all the other things besides podcasts that we do, such as my recent review of the new film about St. Francis Xavier Cabrini. You won't want to miss that one. So again, catholicculture.org/newsletter. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I want to start talking about your career in general a little bit because, of course, it's going to be of interest to a lot of people that you have had two pretty serious careers going. What I mentioned in public service, in health law, and things like that, but also publishing quite a bit of poetry, some real fine scholarship and artistry in your translations, and of course, you have a family. So I'm sure a lot of people will be interested to know. How you managed to do that, and also some lessons you've learned from doing those things, or any advice you would have for artists who have a day job, which is many of us.
Sure. Well, like a lot of things in my life, it was pretty accidental. I went off to college thinking I would be an English teacher, upgraded that a little bit to wanting to be an English professor. And I took a hard shot my senior year because I'd come close on a lot of major fellowships, but I didn't win. And I didn't have the money to go on my own. And I actually won a significant Yale-funded fellowship. And then they called me into the office and said people with my politics should not be in academia, and they took the fellowship away from me.
Oh, wow.
And so I was left second semester senior year trying to figure out what plan B was. And I had what got me in trouble with the Yale bureaucracy is I had been president of the Yale Political Union. And I was the first one to win an election in 20 elections that came from one of the more conservative parties. And that was, I guess, scandalizing to the administration. And so then I had to sort of make it up as I went along. And for me, I did a very radical thing beginning of my senior year, which is didn't really have a clear professional plan. But I decided that the most important thing was getting married, which nobody was doing at Yale in 1977. So I proposed very awkwardly to my then girlfriend, still my wife. And when my plan kind of went off the rails, we went back and stayed for the summer with our parents, saved up some money with old summer jobs, and decided that we'd negotiate what we were going to do next. And so her first choice was to go to Manhattan, where she had a lot of family roots, and I'm from Boston. And I said, no, that's crazy. I'm not going to do that. And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, why don't we go to Hawaii? And she said, Hawaii? So what would we do in Hawaii? And I said, it doesn't matter. It's Hawaii. We could get any old jobs, learn how to surf or something like that. And she said, well, long silence. She said, I don't like the way I look in the bathing suit. What's your next choice? And I said, well, I've had some friends that have gone to Washington and worked on Capitol Hill. They seem to have had a good time. Why don't we try doing that? And she said, okay. So we went and did that, both of us. And that got me started in politics. And I have thought many times how my whole career would be very different if my wife's body image was a little different. And but I gave up writing poetry. I had sort of a discouraging writing workshop in college with Christopher Reeve's father, who was a difficult man. And so I stopped. Everything going on, I stopped writing poetry. I stopped for about a decade. And we stayed for a few years, decided I was going nowhere fast. And so I decided to do the more conventional thing, went back to law school, and which for me was also home. And started to do the more conventional things. We bought this house that I'm still sitting in today. And, didn't have sort of big plans. And I was going through a really boring stretch in Boston's largest law firm, down in the basement of the New England Telephone Company, with a young college graduate who'd been indentured to me because the work was so boring and grim. And all of a sudden she got very angry and looked at me and said, I did 4 years at a top college and I'm doing this. And I won't say what came after this, but you have to censor it. And I said, well, I did the same 4 years, and 3 years of law school and a federal clerkship. I'm doing the same stuff you are. And calmed her down. I eventually wrote her a law school application, recommendation, that kind of thing. And just a few days later, I got a call totally out of the blue inviting me to a sub-cabinet job in Washington, and really felt called to do it because, public service was, an important thing in my family's values. And I aspired to do it, but didn't think I would get very high and that it wouldn't probably happen for a very long time. So when it happened higher than I expected and much earlier, I was very excited. And I was lucky that I had chosen well with my bride, because I think a lot of spouses would have had a fit and said, no, you can't do this. And she said, no, if you need to do this, and we'll figure out a way to make it work. And so at a very early age, I started the government career. And I was down there when I picked up the Washington Post on a weekend. And my now friend, who I just got off the phone with about an hour ago, Dana Gioia, had written a review of the new Philip Larkin Collected. And I had vaguely remembered Larkin from one anthology in high school, but I wasn't really familiar with Larkin. And I said, not only do I want to read this book, I think I want to write poetry like this. One of the things that I think was holding me back is I was trying to write what was popular at the time, and it was imitative and that kind of thing. I thought, I want to learn how to write like Larkin. And so I started working on it on days and weekends. My bride had been encouraging me to have a quote-unquote hobby. She said, you don't want to get boring just working and having time with the kids. But a lot of things that people do are a lot of time away from home, like golf. So I set out to teach myself how to write poetry, which took longer in those days because there's no internet yet. But eventually, felt comfortable with what I was writing, started sending it out. A little bumpy in the beginning, but I got a big break in 95. One of my sonnets won the Howard Nemeroff Sonnet Award at the late lamented Journal of the Formalists. And that kind of set me going. But I adopted the pseudonym because I knew enough about the worlds I operated in, on the corporate and legal side. Doing something artistic was considered flaky. And on the artistic side, having a serious corporate job or serious government job was considered, well, you're not really one of us because we don't do that. And so I thought it was, best to, just keep that separate and keep it quiet, and pick as bland a pseudonym as I could. And then I just kept going. And, it was, for me, it was the nights and weekends and long plane flights and things like that. I mean, at some point, particularly when I was working as a lawyer, you have to be careful about having confidential documents out on the plane. I've read about a number of potential merger acquisitions just looking over my shoulder and looking at the seat next to me. So I tended to, stop working on planes, but then I could do poetry, and think about them on the commute, work on weekends and stuff. And that was actually one of the nice things about translation, particularly when I was doing the Latin elegies and stuff. You can just say, okay, I'm going to do 2 couplets today. And you ought to be able to do that. And you ought to be able to squeeze that, into your day. And it may not sound like very much, but if you do that kind of day in, day out, it starts to add up to a book before too long. And so for a long time, that's how I managed it. And I was pretty happy with that. I didn't really want to be outed. Jody Bottom, the then editor of First Things, had been trying to get me to be outed in his magazine for a long time. I kept putting him off. But when I was running Social Security, one of the 3 main unions was desperate to force me out. And so they formed a committee to try to find dirt on me. And they went for a long time. They didn't find any. They sent me harassing stuff at home and that kind of stuff. But they didn't find any. And then finally, by reading the SF 286, they figured out that I was publishing poetry on the side. And they thought, we got him. And they gave it to a harsh critic of the agency who normally just tears executives apart. And he tried to tear me apart a number of times. And the guy didn't even know what to do with it. So he reported it, but it wasn't like it was particularly negative. And Jody found out and said, okay, now you got to let me do this nicely for real. So then I consented to the Paul Mariani outing piece, which is lovely. But it did change things a little bit. Not as much as I thought. It was a little awkward from time to time, but didn't change things right. But I did kind of prefer to have my privacy and, just sort of chug along the way things were.
It's something that occurred to me, and I really should have used this to introduce you, but I sort of forgot, is that your career as a poet and a public servant is not at all unprecedented in the history of English language poetry. In fact, many of the early poets in what I would call modern English, post 1500 or so, were public servants. They were courtiers or ambassadors, things like that. And they, from what I understand, they did not even publish their poetry publicly often. It was circulated among their friends, and it was maybe considered a little déclassé to publish it and sell it. Of course, you and I wouldn't agree with that, but it's just very interesting to see that, when everybody thinks, well, if you're an artist, then you should really do it full time, or you should, you should at least have a job teaching at a university or an academia or something like that. You should be a scholar. That's not how things sort of started out. And, Sir Philip Sidney, for instance, I think the first time his poetry was actually published was because the Catholic composer William Byrd set some of his poems to music. So it was never published originally just as poetry by itself. So I wonder if you see yourself in that lineage to some extent.
Oh, yeah. It keeps me from thinking I'm too out of duck. I mean, if you go way back, it really was the norm because Roman education, once you finish, you were considered qualified to write a poem, to argue in court, or do public service. The sort of the MFA and the MPA and the JD were all sort of combined in the same, course of education. And it didn't really change very much, really, for a long time. A little bit in the 19th century. But, Chaucer was a public servant. For a while, he lived over the gate to London, and I gather that meant he got paid to get through, into the city and that kind of thing. So there were a lot of poet public servants for a long, long time. It's not been so much in this country. In the 19th century, a lot of poets had minor civil service jobs. that they were given really to support their writing. So Whitman and Melville and I'm leaving somebody else out, but there were a number of that. In the 20th century, it kind of we started developing the sort of the professionalization of the artist, which is now I think moved to an extreme and is really hurting literature a lot. But you had Archibald MacLeish, who is the only 20th century poet I'm aware of who also held a Senate confirmation job. So he was briefly an assistant secretary of state, in addition to being the Librarian of Congress. But there really aren't a lot. There were famously, Jimmy Carter wrote poetry. My wife and I were his closest neighbors, along with our other apartment building friends back in the 1970s. There are a couple, and God bless the man. I know we have the same birthday, so I know he's about ready to turn 100 later this year. But some of them, Senator William Cohen from Maine, who then became Secretary of Defense, and Senator Gene McCarthy, who made the famous run for the presidency in '68, were both pretty good poets. They never got a lot of attention for it, and I think they had some difficulty finding the time to really focus and build a readership and that kind of thing. But they were pretty good. So it's unusual these days, not totally unprecedented, but unusual. And that's probably a shame. I mean, we should have more people whose professional and artistic lives are linked, because I think they feed each other. I think you're better as an executive if you've thought about the things that art makes you think about, as opposed to just, implementing what HR tells you should be implementing. And I think that your art is better if you've had a real life. It actually came up on my Twitter today.
I saw that.
With a tweet that was about another artistic field, but I think it's the same for poetry, complaining that it's basically been taken over by very young people that have always been in the academy, and then they finish their education and they start writing right away, but they've got nothing to write about. And so I do think, I think at one point in my life I thought it was a disadvantage that I had a late start and I didn't really start writing seriously until my early 30s. But now that I'm a little older, I'm inclined to think that was actually an advantage. That I'm actually doing much better work now for having walked away from it for a long time, done a lot of interesting things in my life that made me think about things, and have things that have shown up in the poetry that not everybody can write about.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. There's so many different things in terms of your translation that I could ask you about, but first I wanted to ask about your general focus. I saw a talk that you gave for First Things years ago, where you mentioned that you have a particular interest in a neglected area of Latin poetry, namely the Latin poetry of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. So after the kind of classical period of Latin verse. So can you just talk about that whole period and maybe why it's been neglected and why you're interested in it?
Sure. So I'm interested because I just think there's a lot of interesting stuff that I wasn't aware of that was written that I had to educate myself about it. And I think, to be blunt, the reason that it's not usually taught in university and stuff is a longstanding bigotry that comes out of British classicists in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who were virulently anti-Catholic. And as soon as Latin literature started becoming Christian, they decided it was worthless, it was degraded, and they're very harsh often in their characterizations of the work of this period. And it's really unfair. I mean, some of it is really very good. I mean, is it Virgil and Homer good? No, generally not. But better than a lot of the things that are taught canonically by people that come out of Eton and Oxford. And I've, been particularly interested in the period where the poets were struggling to figure out how to take their pagan models and create Christian literature. And some of those are abject failures. One point I went out to try to figure out what the earliest Christian poetry was. And there's some debate about that, but there's at least a good argument that it's someone named Commodianus. And it's some of the worst stuff you've ever seen. It's bad Latin, even accepting that Latin in that period had changed from classical Latin. It's bad in terms of content. I believe he was eventually labeled a heretic by the church. So there's some failures, and there's a lot of really bad didactic poetry, like Laurentius. But I'm fascinated. I've set aside for a little while. Sometimes I have a short attention span. I get excited about projects. I've got a lot of projects sort of on the shelf. But one of the ones that's close, you mentioned the Phoenix poems. One of the ones I find fascinating that almost nobody has read is Lactantius's Phoenix poem. And that really is, in my book, the first concerted, successful attempt by a Christian poet to take the classical models and make them Christian. And
what's funny is I believe I have read that, but it was rendered in prose.
Yes,
the
probably.
Translation that I read. So I think I didn't even know it was a poem, to be honest.
Yes, yeah. And so, and he did a brilliant job. So, he takes the Ovid Phoenix myth, which was probably taken from the Egyptians, and makes it with a fairly light touch, a Christian allegory. And of course, the Phoenix myth is perfect for persuading people that they should be taking the resurrection seriously. And it's a beautiful poem. What I've just had published, and I'm reading next week part of the Old English Phoenix, which I find kind of amusing because it's long. And in the beginning, you could tell that the anonymous author was kind of annoyed with Lactantius on a number of the choices that he made. But it was interesting. By the time they got to the end of, I think it's 676 lines, he's mellowed quite a bit. So his perspective on Lactantius kind of evolves over the length of the poem. But there's a lot of fascinating stuff there. A lot of it's very unpredictable. Aldhelm learned Latin at a time when there was almost nobody in Britain who knew Latin. There had not been, any Latin poets that we know of in Britain. So they had to import a tutor from Ireland. And Ireland was really wild in those days because, they had been cut off in so many ways from the mainland that they had developed their own sort of bizarre literature. They had very few original Latin texts. They had commentaries, and they had a lot of secondary sources, and they had grammars and that kind of thing. And so they kind of made up their own literature in lots of ways, and it was really very odd. James Joyce was really interested in that, and that is a very logical combination because they were experimental in some ways in sort of the same style that Joyce was. And that has kind of gotten, again, by the classicists, read out of the literature.
What's really striking to me is that Catholics don't even read this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we read, of course, we read Dante, we read Chaucer, we read stuff as soon as it gets into the vernacular, even Anglo-Saxon stuff we read, but not if it was, we don't read any, I never hear about, Latin Anglo-Saxon poets or I just... I picked up a book of poems by Prudentius and that I saw in a used bookstore, early Christian poet. I haven't read it yet. I know a little bit about him, but I never hear anybody quoting him or talking about him. So, it's just interesting that these things haven't really even been recovered in the Catholic world, except for as a patristic historical footnote or something.
There's a lot of there are a lot more people paying attention today than 25 years ago, but it's still a pretty small number of people. There are some really good young classic scholars who are paying serious attention. I mean, there's James Uden at Boston University, and Victoria Mall at the University of London, and some marvelous people. And so I think there's hope, but it is just, for me, it's bizarre that the whole tradition linking the classical world and the medieval world was kind of read out of existence. And again, I think with very bad motivation.
Right.
And so I felt sort of a mission. So I've done a couple of these late antique translations with Aldhelm and Maximianus, and a significant number of the poems in the delayed Phoenix anthology are from that period as well. And I've done, other stray stuff. And there's a lot of really good, interesting work. There's also a ton of stuff that's just never been translated, which is, for a translator, I view that as an opportunity. And I can do that because I'm a non-academic. If I were an academic, there'd be all kinds of discouragement from doing that. I think in general sense, well, if no one's bothered translating it up until now, how could it be worth translating? It's sort of circular logic that way.
Right.
And I'm free of all those constraints. And so I just kind of can plow through and do what I want. And if it's not making my life better, I can drop it and I can do something else. And I think, it's nice having that freedom, which I think a lot of people doing translation don't have.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess if you're, doing the hymns in the Divine Office, the Liturgy of the Hours, you get some of this stuff, hymns by Saint Ambrose and things like that. But, that's about all that most, Catholics would be exposed to. So who was Saint Aldhelm then? He was, what century did he live in? He was an Anglo-Saxon bishop, right?
Yes. So he, there's debate about his birth. It's probably sometime between 635 and 640. We know his death was 709. He was a member of either a royal family or a major noble family. There's, again, debate about that. And you have to remember that when the Romans left Britain abruptly in the early 5th century, the country fragmented into a lot of small kingdoms. And they came and went and absorbed each other and reformed. And it was kind of chaotic, which is one of the reasons why it's a little hard to trace Aldhelm's background. But he eventually became a bishop. I think he's an undervalued figure in the history of Western literature. He is, I think, and again, academia doesn't even seem to be interested in this question anymore, but I think he wrote the first European poem with end rhyme and accentual meter that was not a hymn, an actual poem. It's called the Carmen Rhythmicum. And so he's important that way. Is that a great poem? No. It's an okay poem, but it's not a great poem. In the riddles, which I love, they're a little bit uneven. And I'm sympathetic to this because, it starts with great inspiration. So the first 8 riddles or so, I just adore. And you know that that's the way he started. But then I also relate to this. He ran out of gas. And so they started becoming... he was really looking for what poets today call prompts. And so he would forage through his library, trying to find things that would stir riddles. And sometimes those are magnificent. I love the one on the cauldron, which was also one of the 2 that Richard Wilbur translated. But there are some that are a little bit less spectacular. But overall, they're very interesting. And of course, to understand them fully, I had to do a lot of research. And I figured as long as I was doing that, I ought to do a full-blown commentary, which hadn't been done on Aldhelm before. And it was great fun. I think it's the only translation. Usually when you get towards the end of a translation project, it just sucked the life out of you, and you're happy when it's over. You're glad you did it, but happy it's over. The one where I was sad that it was over was the Aldhelm, because the commentary and figuring out what was really being said in these poems, which scholars hadn't worked out for most of them. It was like a scavenger hunt, of the 7th and 8th and 6th centuries, and it was great fun in a way that translating often is not fun. So I loved them, and the riddles set off a whole riddle tradition. The Old English riddles, the Exeter riddles, are really based on Aldhelm. Some of them are just translations, basically, of Aldhelm. And Gregory the Great and others developed riddle collections. And it was a popular form going well into the Middle Ages, and then it kind of petered out. So he was very influential. He apparently was a very charismatic man. There are anecdotal accounts that he had an evangelical mission, because Britain was not predominantly Catholic and Christian in those days. There was still very heavy pagan representation. So he was really looking for ways to bring people into the faith. And the riddles have that purpose, and it is sort of palpable. He was also alleged to have tried to recruit people when, I guess, it wasn't going so well in his church. He would stand in front of the church and sing in Old English to lure people into the church. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But that's the story that about a century after his death started being reported. And you do get that sense that, that's consistent with, his manner. He clearly had a little bit of a temper, too. It's sort of interesting for me. There are a few cheap shots at the Irish in some of his prose, which I had, took a little personally once in a while. But, but he's a major figure. One of the disappointments for me is that I was hopeful that the book would get read more, get a little bit more attention. My press didn't really help me out at all on that. And in particular, I've been thinking in recent years, if you're teaching Latin in a homeschool environment, it really is a marvelous opportunity. Little pieces that are short are a lot less discouraging, I think, to teenagers. If there's an amusing aspect to it, then that's helpful. And then it's everything that's in the back. Not all of it's going to be interesting to someone studying Latin for the first time, but a lot of it is. Why does the punchline for this riddle work? And so I still would love to see, with the burgeoning homeschool movement in classical studies, I still have this dream that people will start picking up the Aldhelm and using it a little bit.
Well, I'm learning Latin right now, so I might take your suggestion and use that as reading. I'm aiming for reading fluency for myself, so I might use that as material.
Good. It's reasonably accessible Latin. He takes a little criticism from people that think his Latin wasn't that good, because he did write very contained line by line. He didn't jam. And there are people that think he was following models too closely, and he didn't really have the capacity to do that. I think that's wrong. But it is, I think, easier Latin than a lot of the late antique Latin. The Irish stuff is really, really hard. And the Maximianus was very difficult. The Maximianus is deliberately ambiguous over and over and over again. So figuring out how to render it in a translation, is hard. But the Aldhelm, I think, it was meant to be accessible. It was meant to be an evangelical tool. And so you make it too hard, you're defeating your purpose. So I think that I think you got my stamp of approval on using it for that purpose.
Would you like to read a couple of his riddles so people get a sample?
Sure. So I have two favorites. So as I mentioned, the first, really 7, are different in character from the rest, and you can tell it's the original inspiration. And they have a mystical quality to them. And you'd see mysticism in Latin poetry, Christian Latin poetry, much more often in the coming centuries. But at this point, it was still pretty unusual. And so I've always liked this one. You want me to read it to you and try to guess the answer to it?
Sure.
Sure. So this is number 6. I share now with the surf one destiny. In rolling cycles when each month repeats. As beauty in my brilliant form retreats, so too the surges fade in cresting sea.
Well, I think I might have read this online and seen the solution for this, but is this the moon?
It's the moon.
Yeah.
The moon. Yeah. And the other one, so I took a seminar in college under Harold Bloom, so I'm very aware of the anxiety of influence. And I have never felt it more than when I translated 49, because Richard Wilbur, who was always a great inspiration to me and someone who I got to know because of this book, and I believe it's the last book he ever blurbed, translated 2 of Aldhelm's riddles, including this one, 49. And I think this came out really well. I probably worked twice as hard on this one as any of the others because I knew it was going to be compared to Richard Wilbur's, and I didn't want to look, I didn't want to be embarrassed by the comparisons. 49. As pounded gaping metal, wide, gross, round, I hang untouched by boundless sky or ground. Glowing in flames and fevering with bubbles, I thus confront 2 fronts with different troubles, as I survive both being scorched and drowned. So I'll let you off the hook early on this one. So this is a cauldron, and it has paradox as a way of accessing truth. You've got the being both scorched and drowned, and the cauldron in this time period was a symbol of hell, which makes sense, when you think about it. So it's a poem, it's a riddle with, I think, some serious Christian underpinnings that, probably not obvious right at the beginning. And I think a lot of the riddles are this way, and that I think again makes them a good teaching tool because at some point you can access most of these pretty quickly, figure out what's going on some basic level and figure out how to get to the answer. But then if you look at them a second and a third time, you start understanding why he wrote it in the first place and what the underpinnings are. And there is this serious Christian underpinning to a lot of the joke. Basically. Could
this be compared to like the tradition of the bestiary in medieval times with a kind of a moralistic slant? Because these poems are not on, from what I understand, mostly the riddles are not about, Christian theology on the surface, or they're about things in the natural world, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. So, I like to think there are about a dozen things about Aldhelm that I noticed in this book that hadn't been previously noted, in the literature. Some of them are so obscure that we would put your listeners to sleep if I started talking about them. But one of them is exactly what you said, is the medieval bestiaries. And so, one of the great things about doing this work in this time period is it's much easier to look smarter than you really are because there are computerized databases that cover most of Latin literature. So if you're trying to figure out where things came from, you can go through and very systematically figure out, where some things were taken from. And I figured out something that I think the few scholars who deign to get in this area, always just want to assume that authors were reading the canonical works. And that's not the way the world works a lot of the time. So Aldhelm, the bestiaries were really important. A lot of these poems are drawn from the bestiaries. He liked to travel. He took one trip to Rome. As far as we know, that's the only trip that he took. But he loved travel literature, and that's considered by classicists and medievals to be junky stuff. Some of it is, not all of it is, but some of it's junky stuff. But he loved that, so there's a lot of influence of those texts on the Riddles, and there are other areas of less highbrow literature that he enjoyed as well. And he had an enormous library. I mean, one of the things that always makes me sad, I did a piece on this recently for the online site Antigone. Art is lost literature. My most recent book of a couple months ago, I did a sort of imaginative recreation of a lost Aristophanes comedy called Girlatee from the quotations and secondary sources. And the thing that saddened me about Aldhelm is he apparently had the last copy of Lucan's Orpheus. Lucan was a wonderful poet, and his memory was large. His work was largely wiped out because he got caught opposing Nero and had to commit suicide.
I was just listening to a Dana Gioia interview yesterday where he mentioned that because he was Seneca's nephew, right?
Yeah. And so we've got his epic on the Civil War. We don't have any of the others. And he was only 25 when he died. He was remarkably prolific. And I've always loved the Orpheus story, which figures in Girlatee. And the only little bits that we know about Lucan's Orpheus come from the prose writings of Aldhelm. And you wonder, what the heck happened to the library,
Well, if you're interested in lost works, you must be excited about this new news about the Herculaneum library. So I've actually been to Herculaneum. I didn't know about the library at the time because it was, several years ago. But Herculaneum, for people who don't know, is kind of like a smaller version of Pompeii. It's in that region. But whereas Pompeii was destroyed by lava, as I understand it, Herculaneum was covered by ashes. And so the things there were carbonized. You can go there and see skeletons of people, who in the poses in which they died, which is kind of spooky and thought-provoking. But also, there was a whole library of a guy who had a massive library, and just, the forecourt of that library has been excavated so far, so to speak. They've basically, because these things were burnt to a crisp, there was no way to open them without damaging these scrolls significantly. But they've found a way through technology now to read these things with lasers or something.
I've been tweeting about this a lot. For any of your listeners who are interested, it's difficult. It's at AM Juster. And for me, it combines my worlds because, I love classical literature and that type of thing. But I also, for a brief time, was interim CEO of an imaging company.
Oh, okay.
And so, the whole idea of using cutting edge imaging technology to open these things, it just gets me going. I'm like a 6-year-old at Christmas. And so I've been, and the 2 points. One is the classicists, who can really be a downer group sometimes, are kind of poo-pooing a lot of this because the ones that have been opened and read are all a particular school of Greek philosophy. And there's this thought,
Epicurean,
this is
right?
not that, Epicurean. It's not that big a deal. It's all just, we don't know that. I've got a pretty good sized library here, and it's, I moved most of my other stuff to the summer house, and it's almost all poetry, but it's not. mean, how many
Right.
people have 1,100 volumes or whatever it is, and it's all just one topic?
Right.
And so I'm holding out real hope that even in what we have, that there's a real chance of seeing some remarkable new literature. And as you said,
people are speculating, could there be, I would love to see Aristotle's Lost Dialogues or, something like that. And that would be amazing.
Well, and, the other thing is, as you said, they haven't even excavated the whole area yet.
Right.
So that's, one other reason to be excited for the future. But the other thing, because I've been Herculanean too, and I don't know if you remember when you're in the pit, if you're looking, I can't remember which direction it is, but there's a huge part of what was Herculanean that has been built over in a way that it would be very difficult to excavate. So they're probably going to be pulling things out of Herculanean for the next century. So even after they excavate the area near, these scrolls, there's still the potential, given the way that the city was destroyed, there's still the potential for other scrolls for a long, long time. So I'm hopeful that a lot of these gaps are going to be filled in over time.
Right. I doubt it'll save Western civilization or anything, but it'll still be some pretty cool
it will make me happy,
Yeah. One more question about St. Aldhelm. You mentioned in your an article that you wrote about him that he sort of combines in his Latin verse. He sort of combines Latin verses with stylistic traits from Anglo-Saxon poetry of the time. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Maybe read one of his poems in Latin.
Yeah. See, I think one of the things that people don't appreciate about this period of history, they used to think about the Roman Empire where it was amazingly coordinated, and then they think about the Europe of the medieval times where there was a lot of commerce, commercial and intellectual, between the countries. While occasionally this gets overstated, Britain was pretty isolated from the continent. Ireland was pretty isolated from the continent. Even I think going to Britain was a big deal. And so a little bit like me in my early 30s trying to teach myself how to write formal poetry without an internet, Aldhelm had to kind of teach himself. And a significant percentage of probably the poetry that he had heard would have been Anglo-Saxon. So the classical aversion to alliteration would not be something that Aldhelm would have embraced. He would have embraced the opposite. And I'm not sure if I can at random pick out a poem where the alliteration is clear in the Latin. Why don't you give me a few seconds and let me see if I can do it. But I might.
Sure.
All right. Well, the first one, I looked at is Riddle 4. And it's crede mihi res nulla manet sine me moderante. So there in the first line, you have 4 words that start with M. Never would see that in classical Latin. I think even in humorous classical Latin, you would never see that much.
Yeah, that's quite interesting to me. I mean, I like the Anglo-Saxon alliterative tradition, so to see that done in Latin is fascinating.
And it's having an interesting revival. There's a group that's organized to talk about this and debate about it and stuff that I'm theoretically a member of, and I've been too busy to really participate. But people are interested in it again, so I'm actually feeling good about it because I started actually writing poems in Anglo-Saxon meter about almost 10 years ago. Yeah, and I really enjoy it. There's something just different about it. It's different from regular free verse rhythms. It's different from.
I think there's just something sort of vigorous and virile about it somehow.
It has there's real pulp in it. You just and a power. It's just different from writing in other forms. So I've enjoyed it.
And it's distinctive to the English language.
Pardon?
And it's distinctive to the English language.
Yes.
I mean, the accentual. Dana Gioia has an essay on his website about accentual verse as sort of like the natural, form of English. So
Yes.
there's just something that feels very, even to someone who's not used to reading it, for an English reader, it just feels very natural. And
I mean, it's I've wandered around a lot of languages and literatures. I'm not aware of another. I mean, except for the languages that are very closely related to Old English, Welsh, Gaelic, Icelandic. You'll see heavy use of alliteration, but most cultures, most languages, they don't have this sort of prohibition against it that classical Latin has. But it's I'm not aware that it's really a basis of a prosody in the same way.
This is a very general question, but any thoughts on the way that your Catholic faith has informed your attitude towards public service and poetry, and even perhaps any connections between those two?
Sure. So this is something where a lot of your younger listeners might be surprised, but my family, my mom was 100% Boston Irish. My dad was probably a little bit less than half Irish, and both obviously Catholic. And they had experienced a fair amount of discrimination when my dad was in the service in the 1950s in the South. And John F. Kennedy getting elected in 1960 was a huge thing for the family, because it wasn't even so much that here you had this charming, charismatic president, but he was Catholic. It was an issue in the campaign, and he was Irish. He was Boston Irish, and so in my family, that was huge. And the Kennedy presidency, I think, infused the whole family with excitement about public service. And as a Republican, I have to be careful about this, because I remember when poor Dan Quayle tried to embrace the Kennedys while debating Lloyd Benson, who I became friendly with Benson when I was in Washington for a while, who was very different from the way that I expected him to be. And I think that carried over into the family, because I have a daughter who is in the 0.1% of young people who goes into Teach for America and stays on mission. So she's still, after 15 years, a public school teacher in the inner city in Nashville, Tennessee. And I have a son who was in the Army National Guard for a long time and did active duty in Afghanistan, very dangerous duty, and in fact was injured a bit in Afghanistan. So the value of public service, I think, has been a strong one in our family. And I think, again, at the risk of derision, a lot of it goes back, I think, to the Kennedy presidency, which was, such an enormous thing in our family, and it's sort of a matter of great pride.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. But anything about, the Catholic faith personally for you that has influenced your attitude towards, poetry, public service, either, or even shown you any kind of unlikely connections between those two things?
Yeah, I think in the poetry, there are obviously several religious threads, some of which have gotten stronger over time. I think a lot of my poems talk about, directly or indirectly, the difficulty of grace. I am always a little put off when I'm watching some very young person who's very religious, and it just seems like everything is easy and worked out. And kind of maybe that's the Catholic perspective in a lot of ways, that a lot of this is supposed to be hard. If it's easy, you're not doing it right. So difficulty of grace. I think as I've gotten older, there's a lot more meditation on mortality. There's a little bit more sense of urgency. There's a little bit more sense of life being short. Having had, depends a little bit on how you count it, but 3 near-death experiences, 2 of them since I left the government. It gets you thinking about your faith more. I write more poems that have religious texture to them today than I did originally. I think I always did to some extent, but I think more so today than 30 years ago.
Actually, since we're on that topic, I didn't mention this poem as a possibility to read beforehand, but would you be willing to read Vertigo since you've mentioned this
Sure.
This topic? This is from your last collection of original poems, Wonder and Wrath.
Why don't I read it and then I'll talk about it?
Sure.
Come to some of your own conclusions first. Vertigo. The world turns liquid, reels and rolls, as gravity veers at angles. What was still is blurred and whirled. Revolutions echo. You lie still for hours, too weak for vomiting and still too dazed for prayer. No whiz-bang device can repair your inner ear. Doctors try shifting crystal shards like sad wizards. Sometimes it's magic, sometimes not. They never know. They never know what to advise if that trick fails. Focus your eyes on horizons, one whispered once. It helps to refocus the brain. The brain resets. The brain can reset in the ways my fathers did. When his tumor nicked a vein, cells drowned in blood. His bloodied brain regathered words, word by word. Grace is not crystalline, but grit that squints at pain. Grace is the will to retake things, thing by thing. So I took early retirement because I'm fighting, what I now know is 2 autoimmune diseases. And I didn't, I knew that I was having medical issues, but the doctors were kind of baffled. And I got a diagnosis of severe rheumatoid arthritis in 2011. And then 3 years ago, got a diagnosis of celiac disease, which, having been undiagnosed for so long, has done a fair amount of damage. The rheumatoid arthritis, the inflammation seems to have gotten into the ear at one point. And that's what set off the vertigo. And it is, it's a horrible experience in the more severe cases. I mean, sometimes you get a little touch of it and it's a little dizziness and it's not so bad. But you get a severe case of vertigo. I mean, you're really disconnected from the world. You can't even, see hard objects around you. Everything is a blur that's just moving, and you've got this awful nausea and that type of thing. And for me, as I started thinking about that, and fighting back from that, I drew some strength from remembering my father's battle with an astrocytoma, the same kind of brain cancer that got Ted Kennedy and John McCain. And it's a terrible way, to go. And his path was harder than theirs in that he got a massive cerebral hemorrhage early. And we thought we were going to lose him then. But he regained consciousness. He was pretty damaged in the beginning. But then his brain began to rewire the way that stroke victims' brains often rewire. And he kind of took back the world, word by word by word. And so I started connecting a little bit with, his experience. And, it had a very kind of dramatic end. We went into hospice when hospice was still a fairly new concept back in the 80s. And the hospice people basically decided to kill him. They withdrew food and water. And I came out from Washington and had a fit about it. And we put him back on food and water. And I had some friends that told me I was making a huge mistake, with the best of intentions. But then, to everyone's surprise, he regained consciousness and he said farewell to my mom. So, and it was a very remarkable moment. So, those types of things, I think, are infusing my work more in the last 10, 15 years than they did in the first 10 to 15 years.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, and obviously the whole issue of, palliative care, life support, and all that's very important to have a Catholic point of view on those things.
Yeah.
Do you want to read a couple more of your poems before we end?
Sure.
How about the first one from Wonder and Wrath, which is titled Heirloom?
Yeah. Heirloom. I know that I was suckered in, firm curves bulging, olive skin, perfectly well-rounded cheeks, rubified with port wine streaks, the saffron crown with one deep crack, an eggplant-colored knob and back, a touch of tumor. It would still be sunning on my windowsill, art illustrating daily life, except I took my carving knife and slowly sliced 5 slabs of fresh, soil-sweet, yet vaguely bitter flesh. That's obviously my tomato poem.
Right.
But
every poet has to write one.
It's a classic of the genre.
Yeah.
But it's a poem I don't think I would have written when I was first 10 years I was starting out. And I think I'm taking more joy in daily things, noticing daily things. I think I was always doing some of that, but I think I do that more. And I think I've got a deeper sense of how the world damages and changes the things it should be celebrating. When we think about tomatoes, particularly, what I grew up eating in the 60s and 70s, and, sort of tasteless, plasticky, vaguely pink kind of thing. They're not that big on tomatoes. But, you get an heirloom tomato, fresh, and the feel, the colors, the flavors. I mean, it's just something that we should be reminded that we need to savor those types of things. And that's really why I wrote the poems.
Now, your poems are very musical in general, something that I appreciate as a musician myself. It's something that always the element of poetry that I'm the most tuned into. I'm not always great with subtext, but the musicality of it I get. There's a kind of course, you're good with forms and things like that, but there's also sort of like an internal musicality to it with, some of the alliteration and the last slowly sliced 5 slabs of fresh, soil sweet, yet vaguely bitter flesh. And just, it also feels very natural within the forms and the meters. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about your practice or your, how you, obviously you have an innate talent, but, how did you develop that musicality in your writing?
Well, it took a long time. It doesn't come naturally, so it's a lot of practice. It's a lot of reading. One of the things that shocks me about a lot of MFA programs is they don't think a lot of reading, particularly, from more musical works, is necessary, and that's a shame. And I think if you go back and look at the first book, I think there's some very good poems in it. But there's also an undercurrent of proving I can do this, sort of showing that, I kind of belong, in the field. And so they tend to be very, very regular in terms of their form. I think in terms of the content, they're often unpredictable, because that's something that people have been saying about my stuff pretty much from the beginning. In the same way that the tomato poem is, kind of throwing you a curveball right at the beginning, make you think you're reading something a little bit more central than just a tomato. But I think as I've progressed and I've kept doing it, I've had much more interest in pushing the boundaries a little bit, trying to find new music. And I've become a lot more confident when I'm experimenting about what I think works and what doesn't. But it took a long time to get there. And there's a lot more experimentation in wonder and wrath, a lot more use of internal rhyme, alliteration in certain places. And then there, the line from which the title of the book comes from is in an alliterative poem. And I think I've just started sketching out in my own mind what the next book of original poetry is probably going to look like. And I think it's going to be, it's still going to be very formal. I mean, I'm not one of those, I'm not going to go Donald Hall on people and embrace form early and then abandon it for modernism, because that's not going to happen with me. But in some of the newer poems, I'm experimenting in different ways, writing some very different kinds of poems, and I think that's good. And part of it is just progressing. Part of it is different stages of life. I've got the luxury now that I can work full time on my poetry, and I work very hard at it. It's producing some things that are often even surprising. To me, it is an amazing thing when you have a poem that's taken shape for the first time, and you look at it and say, "Where the heck did that come from?" And that happens to me from time to time. And those are often the better ones. The ones where you start off and you have a relatively clear idea of how you want it to start and how you want it to finish. Those often don't work as well. You have to put a lot of those on the bone pile. It's the ones that take you by surprise a lot of the times that really are the keepers.
Well, Plato, in one of his dialogues, I forget which one, Socrates says something about how he's not really interested in, reading the poems by people who are completely sane and in control, and he wants the divine madness. So I think
I'll take that as a compliment.
There's always been that wisdom, pre-Christian even, of acknowledging something of divine inspiration and something that we're not totally in control of. So yes, I agree. The poet has to be vulnerable to being surprised by what comes out of him. And some of that is also too just the way that our influences combine in unpredictable ways as well.
Well, at least from my vantage point, too, the world has become a lot more unpredictable. I mean, I think when I was growing up, there was a lot of turbulence and uncertainty about the world. And, I obviously absorbed some of that. But I think, getting into the 80s and 90s, I think that I had a lot more sense that it ultimately was a rational world and we were making progress. Unfortunately, I've lost that sense. And it does mean that what I'm writing is, to me anyway, a lot more unpredictable than it was when I first started out.
One of the poems that's more explicitly religious is An Apostle Falls.
An Apostle Falls. Betrayal had fulfilled the prophecy. Too proud for penance and too weak to run, he strung himself up from a cedar tree and swayed for days beneath a scathing sun. Thieves cut his desiccated body free, then left it in the dust. Throughout that night, Jerusalem kept shuddering with light.
Yeah, that's a great. I love that last image. I think.
Yeah, and that's the one that you look at and you say, well, where did that come from? The rest of the time I was thinking about Judas, and the first 6 lines, they're from the left side of the brain, and then all of a sudden, I'm playing with the language. I'm looking at, and this line just seems to appear. And, the logical part of your brain usually starts to fight, those sorts of intrusions. But you have to take those seriously. You look at them, the more I looked at it, I said, I'm not sure even why this works as well as it does, but I think it does work. And for me, it was a very startling image that somehow just captured what I needed to say.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Another poem having to do with the topic of suicide. One of my favorite poems in the book is titled No. And I promise we will end with something more upbeat.
More upbeat, okay.
After that.
Yeah, so this won one of the big awards in formal poetry. I took some shots from one of the major people in formal poetry about this poem. And I think they were unfair because I'm really not criticizing the person that I'm writing about here. What I'm saying is other people should not follow the example. So for me, this is a poem to save lives, particularly in a culture that I think has excessively glamorized suicide. And it's still probably less so, I think, today than maybe 20 years ago. And this poem is about 20 years old now. But, it's a sonnet. It's called No. No, not this time. I cannot celebrate a man's discarded life and will not try. These knee-jerk elegies perpetrate past nightshade lies. Why should we glorify descent into a solipsistic hell? Stop. Softly curse the waste. Don't elevate his self-suffering to genius. Never tell me he will live on. Never call it fate. Attend the service. Mourn. Pray. Comfort those he lacerated. Keep him in your heart, but use that grief to teach. When you compose a line, it is a message, not just art. Be furious with me, but I refuse to praise him. No, we have too much to lose.
Yeah, that's definitely for me, the most moving poem in the book. Just to me personally, it's a very powerful statement, and I've had the same thoughts at times about these things.
Yeah, it's
suicide is such a terrible thing that it's almost like people have to romanticize it in some way in order to cope with it. But that's a dangerous temptation.
Yeah, and I knew there would be some bad reaction, but I did it anyway. And it was spurred by a real example that was fresh. So I messed it up a little bit so that people wouldn't focus on the particular person, because that's not really what I was trying to actually change the gender of the person. It was actually sparked by a woman, not by a man. And, I think it's an important thing to keep saying. And certainly it's important for poets, but it's, the same general message for a broader audience. I think it's an appropriate poem for that as well.
Right. I mean, and we just had this incident, of course, where, a young man set himself on fire to protest the state of Israel. And many people are glorifying that deed, which is, a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. Okay. So to end on a little bit more of a cheerful note, perhaps you could read Untamed Daughter.
Sure.
That's a fun one.
Make a little note. It's the one typo in the book. They left out one phrase, so I just want to make sure I got it in. The same critic who didn't like No also caught that there was a missing foot in this poem, which was really just a typographical error. So, want to be careful about those things. Untamed Daughter. And the epigraph is from The Taming of the Shrew. Come, Kate, come, you must not look so sour. At 14, she loves being critical and tells me, Shakespeare uses language well, but could have been, more original. I sputter, but rebuttals fail to gel. All those recycled plots make it appear to her he was a sneaky plagiarist, no better than that girl expelled last year. So they should take him off her reading list. Please, Caitlin, let it go. Great writers borrow like gamblers. Don't begrudge the bard a source that he reshaped into Verona's sorrow, Miranda's tenderness, or Lear's remorse, but mark him down at least a point or two, because he tamed a Kate as fierce as you.
Well, I was listening to that with a pen in hand so I can add the missing foot to my edition, which I'm doing now at least
a point or two. Now, fortunately, this, unlike most of my poetry is not drawn very directly from real life. It's pulled, a lot of stuff pulled from different places. Mm-hmm. But this is pretty close to real life. So fortunately, my real life daughter, Caitlin, named after Dylan Thomas's wife, did not find the poem at 14. There would have been hell to pay if she had found it at 14. She didn't find it until she was about 20, and she was doing student teaching. So at that point, she was in a mood to embrace the poem. So I never paid the penalty that many dad poets would have paid for writing such a poem.
That's great. Well, Michael, I'm glad you came on. It was great to meet you. Great to talk to you. So thank you.
Likewise.
And I'd love to have you back on, maybe to talk about Petrarch when that next volume comes out.
It's been held up. They've had staffing cuts, so it's been at W.W. Norton for almost 2 years now, and there hasn't been any progress. So I'm anxious for it to come out, and still hopeful that I've given up on this year, but I'm hopeful that it will be out early next year. But we'll see what happens.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Great. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll check out some of A.M. Juster's books. I'll link to them in the show notes. Wonder and Wrath, the most recent collection of original poems, and also St. Aldhelm's Riddles. And again, take that suggestion. Use that for your homeschooling Latin students. I think I will pick up a copy of that myself for my own purposes. So, all right, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks a lot.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.